In part one of this series, I suggested that two choices run the world. This may be an oversimplification, but I believe it rings true. These two choices are reflected in the divine principle of sowing and reaping. Paul described the first choice as sowing to our own flesh and the second as sowing to the Spirit. This principle is what is symbolized by the Garden of Eden. The first outcome of sowing and reaping correlates with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which represents the law of God. Putting it simply, this is Old Covenant. The second choice correlates with the tree of life, which reflects the spiritual aspect of God's law, which is love. This is New Covenant. The first choice leads to either good or evil, but the second choice always leads to life. In part two of this series, I propose that everyone passes through the first to reach the second. There are no exceptions, so free will has no part. Putting it bluntly, we don't get a choice. Paul confirms this stance in Romans 8:20, stating for the creation, that is, you and me, was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him, that is, our Maker, who subjected it in hope. This may seem unfair, but that's simply because we are ignorant of the thoughts and ways of our Creator. Wait a minute. Doesn't the story of Adam and Eve indicate that they had a choice? On the surface, maybe, but beneath the surface, no. Tradition has long taught that God made Adam and Eve perfect. Then, after their temptation, they fell from their perfection, Satan succeeding in accomplishing his crafty wiles. I haven't believed this for a very long time. Furthermore, Adam and Eve were not the parents of the human race. They were representatives. Just as one policeman represents the entire police department, so too does Adam and Eve typify the first generation of humankind, and every generation thereafter. Paul spoke of him as the first man, typifying the natural. The story of Adam and Eve is a presentation of the natural man in all of us, and how we fall into carnality. This fall into carnality is illustrated in Genesis chapter 3. This is how every person begins their life, and why Paul said, "For as in Adam all die." All die, again indicating a lack of choice in the matter. Remember, in the beginning, God had no man to till or work the ground, symbolic of the heart. He then planted a garden, or instituted the principle of sowing and reaping, placing us into it to till the ground from which we were taken. In other words, to experience the principle of sowing and reaping in its reality. Further understanding is gleaned from the following. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived. Is this not sowing and reaping? It is, and Paul saying that the natural is first, agrees with the fact that Cain was a tiller of the ground or earthy, like father, like son. I have acquired a man from the Lord, said Eve. Might this typify the natural man? And Abel? Abel was a keeper of sheep. Is this not self-explanatory, typifying a love for others? Evidently, Cain struggled with this as indicated by his statement to the Lord, Am I my brother's keeper? This was, of course, after he killed his brother Abel. We call this justification. Why did he kill his brother? Because he was of the wicked one, and his brother's works were righteous. Sound familiar? It should, for this is why they murdered the Lord. Let me reiterate. The story of Adam and Eve is a presentation of the natural man in all of us, and how we fall into carnality. Paul tells us that the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. Foolishness to him? Do I detect a hint of pride or arrogance in this statement? I believe so, and that is exactly the element that brings our fall from grace. Maybe the serpent of Genesis 3 is not a fallen angel, but a representation of the pride and arrogance that springs out of our being. Doesn't Proverbs state that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall? Now, here's the kicker. Pride is an inordinate love of the self. Love? Yes, love. John wrote, God is love, not does love, although he does, but is the very substance of love itself. Having declared that he is making us in his image, we are love as well, but as reality attests, love can be misdirected. And this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. Ever wonder why it is so difficult for us to be turned around? Because love is the most powerful force in the world. And when our love for darkness is sown into the hearts and minds of the next generation, it becomes even stronger. Note what Jesus said in the following. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, you will indeed hear but never understand, and you will indeed see but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear. All of us know what this means, right? But why is this the case? Because this people's heart has grown dull. In other words, this didn't happen overnight. It didn't even happen in one generation. Rather, it happened over a long period of time. What we are seeing today is a product of many generations before us. Our phrase grown dull in Matthew 13 is defined by Strong's as thick. To thicken, that is, by implication, to fatten. Figurative, stupefy or render callous. Oxford Languages defines callous as showing or having an insensitive and cruel disregard for others. This seems to fit quite well in our present society, does it not? For this people's heart has grown dull. Not person's heart, but people's heart. This is collective, generational, exponential. I am reminded of the following. When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places, seeking rest, and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it also be with this wicked generation. Our word state was inserted by the translators, so it's more accurate to read last of that man. Since this is generational, I believe that man is the carnal man, not an individual. The last of that man corresponds to what Paul said about the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 through 8. In our next study, we will continue our examination of free will.